Mark Rogers TV here just a few hours after the College Football Playoff Committee revealed its first initial standings, 1 through 25. Of course, everybody focused on the first four. We should also take into consideration that there are teams, many teams looming in those next 4, 5, 6, 10 spots even. Because remember that after the two unbeaten teams, there are 17 one-loss teams from Power 5 conferences and Notre Dame. So my initial reaction to this is that it's an incomplete work, of course. We still have plenty of football left to be played. I have no issues with the top four. I don't necessarily think those are the four best teams in the country. I don't necessarily believe that those are the four most deserving teams. Let's put to rest one complete myth, and that's that anybody, myself, Kirk Herbstreit, anybody out there, can possibly say these are the four best teams in the country. That should not be the goal and purpose of this College Football Playoff Committee, because they're reaching for the impossible. They are grasping for immortality beyond. They're reaching for deity if they're somehow going to be able to choose the best four teams in the country. And there's no question those are the four best teams in the country. That's impossible. Okay, we are looking for the four best resumes, the four best seasons, the four best track records to date. So I'm glad that they didn't project into the future. I'm glad of that. I'm glad that in one particular case, they selected the head-to-head winner of a matchup, and I'll explain that in just a second. Unfortunately, they did not choose the head-to-head winner in another matchup that's very similar. So, you know what I'm talking about. Let's start from the top. Mississippi State is number 1. Florida State is number 2. They're two undefeated teams. And yes, not necessarily the two best teams in the country, but they have played every game, all comers, all wins. They are 1 and 2. Marshall's another argument for another day. Okay, after that, a glut of one-loss teams. Who has the best resume? Well, in their estimation, it's the Auburn Tigers, and I understand why. Their one loss was to the number 1 team in the country on the road. It wasn't a particularly close game. It wasn't a blowout. It was a game that Auburn went down 21-0, scratched and clawed to try to get within 2 scores. Basically, that was most of the game. They got within 2 scores and couldn't do better than that. They got to 21-13, but it was a 38-23 final. And so Mississippi State is number 1, Florida State 2, Auburn 3. The Tigers also have one of the more impressive non-conference wins in the country in defeating Kansas State on the road. So the Auburn Tigers at number 3, and that win against LSU looking much better at 41-7 at this point than it did just a couple weeks ago. Ole Miss is number 4, a very controversial selection here. A lot of people across the country, analysts alike, love Alabama, believe that Alabama is dominant. If they are, they will defeat Mississippi State and Auburn. They will go on and win the SEC championship game. And at that point, of course, the Alabama Crimson Tide will have earned a spot into the Final Four. But as it stands right now, Ole Miss and Alabama played. They played in Oxford. We cannot conjecture over who would have won a neutral site game. These games are not played on neutral sites, none of them. So we could conjecture that Michigan State would defeat Oregon in a neutral site. But you know what? They scheduled to play in Eugene, and Oregon won the football game. So in this case in particular, because these two teams play in the same conference, they play very similar schedules, Ole Miss has to be given the nod over Alabama. I heard it today, and this was ludicrous, that last season LSU defeated Auburn about the 6th week of the season. Then as it played out, LSU lost 3 games. Auburn went to the BCS championship game with that just 1 loss. So, of course, Auburn was better than LSU, even though LSU won that game. Okay. I am not promoting a 3-loss team over a 1-loss team. These are 2 teams from the same conference that have played like opponents, Tennessee and Texas A&M most notably, and they have the same record. So that's a tiebreaker. That's an easy tiebreaker that should always stand. 2 teams played head-to-head. They've got the same record, especially if they're in the same conference and have like schedules. The head-to-head winner should always get the nod. Now there are situations, and I'm sure we will see them as this plays out, especially in the SEC West, where Team A beat Team B and Team B beat Team C, but C beat A last year. Michigan State beat Michigan. Michigan beat Notre Dame, but Notre Dame beat Michigan State. That happens over and over and over. It hasn't happened yet concerning these teams, though. So for right now, Ole Miss should get the nod over Alabama. The College Football Playoff Committee got it right. In addition to that, look at the two other comparison games. Texas A&M 59-0 jumps off the page for Alabama. Ole Miss won that game 35-20. Not as impressive? Well, it was on the road, number one. Number two, they led 35-6 before Texas A&M scored 2 garbage touchdowns. Ole Miss completely dominated that game. Tennessee, you could argue that Ole Miss won that in more dominant fashion than Alabama, 34-3. Alabama 34-20 on the road. Ole Miss won that game at home. Again, head-to-head should rule. We'll get to another head-to-head situation very soon because at number 5, just out of the top 4, we've got Oregon. Oregon lost to Arizona. Make all the excuses you want about offensive linemen missing. Fisher, their left tackle, very good player, missing from that game. Arizona has 1 loss. We could excuse Arizona for losing because of a bad field goal kicker, but they lost to USC. Arizona could easily be undefeated. As it stands, Oregon and Arizona have the exact same record. They played head-to-head, and to Arizona's credit, they even went to Oregon and won. And on top of that, compare the Washington State score as well. Oregon barely got by a dismal Washington State team. Arizona this past weekend dominated Washington State. I've heard complaints about Arizona's not that good, and in particular Ole Miss after the showing offensively against LSU in only scoring 7 points, that there's no way that offense should be allowed in the college football playoffs. Well, if their offense is that bad, and Ole Miss is not as good as we think in placing them in the top 4, they're going to show it down the stretch. Let's talk about the record and the conclusions that have already been made, the results already in the record book. Not projections about, well, they're really not that good, so I'm not going to put them in, regardless of what they've proven on the field. Stick to what has happened on the field to date. If Ole Miss isn't that good, they're going to lose anyway. Knock themselves out. Arizona's going to do the same, but not even given a chance. Get this. Oregon and Arizona both play in the Pac-12. Yes, Oregon's got the 1 win over Michigan State, but again, these two teams played. Arizona won at Oregon. Arizona's got the same record. They have a somewhat tainted loss as well against USC, and Oregon is 5, and Arizona is way down at number 12. Not fair, not just. Alabama at number 6, TCU at 7. Of course, the TCU, Baylor, Kansas State trifecta should play itself out. Fortunately, the Big 12's got it right, out of default. They didn't want it this way with no conference championship game, but because of defection, they're down to 10 teams. Therefore, everybody plays everybody. They are the one conference in America that has a true champion. We don't get to see Alabama play Georgia, or Ole Miss and Mississippi State play Georgia. We don't get to see Ohio State in the regular season play Nebraska, or Michigan State play Wisconsin. On and on, the examples are all over the place. But in this case, fortunately, in the Big 12, everybody plays everybody. The no conference championship game should not be held against this conference. If anything, it should be to the Big 12's credit that everybody plays everybody. So, again, the Kansas State, TCU, and Baylor situation with TCU at 7, Kansas State at 9, and Baylor at 13 will work itself out. Arizona State's also an interesting situation. If they continue to win out, they will take on Arizona late in the season, as well as a couple other interesting dates there. Down the line in the Big Ten, as we address that conference, Michigan State would certainly be the one hope for the Big Ten, as Nebraska and Ohio State, their resumes do not resonate with the playoff committee. Michigan State at 8. You got to figure 1 or 2 of those SEC teams are coming off the board in front of them, depending on perception. Oregon still has a championship game in the Pac-12 and a Stanford game this Saturday. TCU could get knocked out again by a Kansas State or somebody else. Unfortunately, this is flawed from the start because we've got 5 conferences. We've got 4 playoff spots. We've got a conference that is depicted as the best conference in college football, some by a wide margin, they believe. I believe that it's by a small margin. I believe also that it shouldn't matter what I think or anybody else should think. It should be the results on the field. And unfortunately, there are not enough games played between Power 5 conference teams. Typically, everybody in Power 5 conference football plays one other Power 5 conference team out of 4 non-conference games. That's not enough. That's the issue in all this. How do we evaluate teams that don't play each other or don't even play like schedules? Baylor didn't play anybody out of conference. Mississippi State didn't play anybody out of conference. And there's a few other teams out there in this mix that played no one. So, again, the flaw begins with 4 spots for 5 conferences, plus Notre Dame, plus if a Mountain West team, not this season, but in the future, they play decent football in the Mountain West, just a tier below the Power 5, that if somebody goes undefeated in one of those conferences, especially, again, the Mountain West Conference, what do you do with them? Don't have time to talk about my playoff scenario and how I would play it all out, but I don't have any issues with the College Football Playoff Committee in this first go-around, this first week's selections, except Arizona should be ranked ahead of Oregon. Would love to hear what you have to say. I'm sure it's a ton, depending on your perspective and what you weight as serious criteria. What are your